think I beat most of the public gallery, so just wait a second.
Of course.
Yes, Mr. Dawson.
Thank you, my lady. Ms Sturgeon, moving on to a different topic, that of border controls. We heard evidence earlier in the module from Mr Halliday, who is the Chief Statistician to the Scottish Government, that the UK Government and Scottish Government would make decisions about restrictions of people coming into the country, going out of the country as regards visiting others or coming in, based on largely the same data about the threat of an individual country. I think he said that the data would often come through the Foreign Office, which would have contacts in the countries to try and work out what the threat was. Is that your understanding broadly of the evidence base upon which decisions was taken, although of course a different analysis of it might have been undertaken?
Yes, that's broadly my understanding. I think as the matter progressed, the Joint Biosecurity Committee became central to the provision of that data.
Yes. And it's fair to say, is it not, that there were, although not necessarily huge differences between the Scottish position as regards which countries people come in or go out to, there were periods where they weren't quite the same as the UK government. For example, on the 3rd of July, the UK government published a list of 59 countries for which quarantine restrictions would no longer apply to travellers arriving in England from the 10th of July. However, at that time, quarantine requirements remained unchanged in Scotland.
Yes, that would be my broad recollection of that. Generally, I think on international travel, rightly or wrongly, there was more alignment than divergence. I think when the air travel started to be opened up in the summer of 2020, the regulations took effect in June 2020. The key difference at that time was that there was, for a relatively short period of time, Spain was one of the countries that the UK government had opened up what was called at the time a travel corridor with, and for a short period of time Scotland didn't do that. We delayed doing that for a period. I think it was then, Spain was then taken off that by all countries later on. Yes,
it might not be entirely surprising that there wasn't huge difference if we're avoiding the word divergence, because it was based on the same data, although the essential point I'm trying to make is that the Scottish Government had, in terms of its devolved public health responsibilities and indeed responsibilities which had been given to it under the 2020 Act, it had the power to control that for Scotland.
Yes, I think borders are one of these areas where the interface between devolved and reserved responsibilities is particularly complex. So the Scottish Government, I think under the Public Health Act 2008, Section 94, I think to be precise, has the ability to put limitations or restrictions on people coming into the country for public health grounds. So that's a statutory position. I think practically we rely on Border Force, which is a reserved organisation, to deliver that in a practical sense. There's then obviously the case that, as we encountered later on, that if there were differences between the two, one of the things that made it difficult for the Scottish Government, whether or not we thought it was desirable to take a different position, is if we may have had a different set of rules at, say, Glasgow Airport, but people, if they wanted to avoid those restrictions, could fly into London and travel up by rail or road. So it was an area where the differences in power and responsibility were often complicated by just the practical realities.
Yes, I think we've seen some documentation that suggests that particular issue, going to Glasgow via Manchester, something like that was an issue early on when travel was a big part of the decision making, and then it came back later on under Mr Yousaf's period as Cabinet Secretary for Health. Could we have a look, please, at INQ 000292564? This is an exchange of emails which shows, we're going to page 6, please. So the page at the top, I think, indicates that the position here, as at the 20th of July, is that the Deputy First Minister was requesting a call to discuss international travel, and that there were a number of people who were involved in that. Page 6, please. Well, where's the passage? Previous page, please. Sorry, Mr. Sturgeon. Yeah, this is, we can see here that it's an email from the Deputy First Minister, Mr. Swinney, to a number of people, including yourself. Is that right? Are we on the same page here? Yes, the 19th of July, Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary Education Skills 2, and there's a number of people listed there.
Oh yes, First
one
Minister,
of whom is First Minister, and a number of others. Some of whom actually we've heard from, Audrey McDougall, Roger Halliday, etc. And this is an email in which some details around the discussion which the Deputy First Minister had been interested in having on international travel, where it says, Ken, I'm extremely concerned about this. Spain is now being held to a much higher level of scrutiny and performance than other countries. If it is not added to the exemptions list, ministers will have to explain why not, when it has an estimated point prevalence rate of 0.015 compared to 0.33 when the decision not include was originally taken. 0.015 is verging on green. And there is visible action from the Spanish authorities to do whatever it takes to suppress outbreaks, compare and contrast with outbreaks in England. It won't matter how much ministers might justify it on health grounds. The Spanish government will conclude it is entirely political. They won't forget there is a real possibility they will never approve EU membership for an independent Scotland as a result. This is an email copied to you. To what extent were concerns about the possibility in the future that Spain would block an application for EU membership by an independent Scotland a factor in the decision-making around the Spanish travel corridor?
They weren't. For me, this email is copied to me. I assume I would have seen it at the time, but I remember very well the decision-making around this. I think it was around the 10th of July that travel corridors were introduced, and we had significant doubts about adding Spain to that because the prevalence of the virus at that time was higher in Spain than it was in Scotland, but that was moving, and over the next couple of weeks, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, that changed. Prevalence was reducing in Scotland, and actually was in Spain and rising in Scotland. These are decisions that were taken for public health reasons. They were, difficult decisions. They were often very finely balanced decisions, and if that concern had been the one driving the decisions, then presumably a great criticism, not least from our own airport sector at the time, we wouldn't have kept Spain off the travel corridors in the first place.
Why is it, though, that there is discussion, if matters are being addressed solely on public health grounds, about the possibility that the Spanish government may conclude that there is a political aspect to things that they will not forget, and that they may vote subsequently against EU membership for an independent Scotland? Why is that even part of the discussion?
It wasn't part of my consideration. I certainly, to the best of my knowledge, didn't have any discussion of that nature. I didn't write that email. I can't speak for other people as to why that was written in that way. What I can tell the inquiry, sitting here today answering questions, is that's not the basis on which the discussion took, not the way in which the decision was taken. These were finely balanced decisions on public health grounds that often, in fact not often, always, clinical advisors would be inputting their own opinions to as well.
Go to page 4, please. This is an email chain. Yes, and an email from Ken Thompson to a number of people. It says there, colleagues, you were mostly on the call with FM and other ministers just now. The FM agreed to a pause in which we were to give her advice on the implications for the Borders review of non-care home COVID cases currently being investigated. We have to do this rapidly, obviously. I'm proposing to write the outline of the advice to ministers and to ask some people to comment and contribute to that. Is the position then that there was on the 20th of July, shortly after this, quarantine requirements for Spain were lifted?
I don't have that date in front of me, but I know it was a relatively short space of time between the Scottish Government not lifting them and lifting them. But if memory serves me correctly, we then very quickly reapplied them. I think all of the countries in the UK
That's correct, as I understand it. On the 20th of July, I think what happened is that you agreed with other ministers that there should be a pause to the restriction, but those were reimposed from the 26th of July.
The relative prevalence was changing at that point. We had reached a point where we thought, on public health grounds, that it was appropriate to add Spain to the travel corridors, and then the data obviously changed that position. Did
the consideration regarding the political implications connected to Spain mentioned in the previous email feature on the call that's been referred to?
Not that I can recall, so that is not my recollection.
But you were the one that made the decision to pause the restrictions, despite the fact that there was concerns about the data upon which such a public health decision might be made?
Well, at that point, the data had reached a position where we felt we could make that decision. I mean, I would suggest that had the consideration that appears in the previous email that was shown to me been guiding the decisions around this, we would not have taken the decision, which was extremely controversial at the time and attracted criticism, I think, from many people, and including very hefty criticism from airports in Scotland and airport in the city. We would not have done that in the first place. The fact that we were, in the face of that controversy, prepared to take a decision that was to continue to apply restrictions to Spain at a time when other parts of the UK were not doing that would, I hope, suggest that these were decisions being driven by data and public health considerations.
But the decision on the 20th of July was that quarantine requirements for Spain should be lifted, but then they were reimposed on the 26th.
And the data was, I mean, I don't know whether it's possible to put on the screen what the changing data around that time would have been. I remember that period. The data was changing at that. This is July 2020. We were, sadly, it was relatively short-lived, but we had reached a low point in cases in Scotland. At that point, Spain had been particularly high. That was the reason for our initial decision. Spain had taken, I think, further steps to suppress the virus. It was coming down there. I'm not sure whether at this point there was even the indication yet of cases starting to rise in Scotland. These were decisions that involved changing data, data that was often changing on a daily basis.
Can we look at page 2, please? And in this regard, again, Dr. Smith says that he asked for a view on the robustness of this data for Spain. There's been a remarkable change in the point prevalence from the set considered previously. It's difficult to reconcile with the public facing evidence of multiple large outbreaks in different areas of the country. And he asks whether can anyone offer an assessment of this. Now, the evidence, therefore, on a public health basis would tend to suggest that there had been multiple large outbreaks, which would not be consistent with the decision taken the next day to lift the quarantine. Is that correct?
No, actually, with respect, I read that differently to that. What I think Dr. Smith is saying here, although he would have to tell you what he meant, is that while we were seeing evidence of multiple large outbreaks in different areas of Spain, and that was what had driven our concern about having restrictions on Spain lifted, the point prevalence data was actually showing something different. It was showing a change that was suggesting that cases were coming down at that point. And not just my reading of this, my recollection of the discussions at the time is that what that is saying is that notwithstanding these very high profile outbreaks, the overall data for Spain shows that the risk is reducing, which was what was driving our decision around the 20th of July to lift restrictions before that data, I think, started to go in the wrong direction in Spain again.
So despite concerns about the robustness of the data in the face of evidence of multiple large outbreaks, you did open up the travel corridor to Spain, albeit only for a short period?
With respect, I do think the interpretation of this that's been put to me is not. What this is saying, and I remember some of the discussions at the time, is that the data, the point prevalence data, was no longer backing up the ongoing restrictions, that despite there appearing to be outbreaks, they were outbreaks in particular parts of the country, and the overall point prevalence data was showing that the risk from the virus in Spain was reducing. And actually, I do consider that this and the discussions that lay behind this were actually what was driving, not that this was contrary to the decision we took at that point, but that was part of what was driving that decision at that point.
But surely it doesn't make a lot of sense if there are issues about the robustness of the data to change the position. And in any event, we know that you had to change it back a few days later.
Mr Dawson, there was issues about the robustness of data at every step of the management of
But would you not take a more precautionary
pandemic
approach if the changes in the data didn't seem to add up?
We were under a lot of pressure from airports at that point. We were under a lot of criticism for being an outlier at that point. I think we were at that point an outlier, and the data, the point prevalence data, was showing that we were no longer able to justify the position we were taking of more onerous restrictions on Spain, and that was the position. The data was particularly around comparisons between different countries. It was changing all the time. It was necessary to assess not just the overall data, but what lay behind that data. If it's what's been put to me here is that this was a politically driven decision, certainly on my part, it was absolutely not. And I come back to this: decisions that were taken by my government in this period. I hope many of them were right. I think some of the outcomes, in a relative sense, suggest that would be the case. Some of them were undoubtedly wrong, but speaking for myself, none of them were driven by extraneous political considerations.
Could I go to INQ 000274-143, please? You will recall that Mr Johnson visited Scotland on the 23rd of July 2020, Sturgeon?
I do.
Yes, and this is a tweet by you where you say, "I welcome the PM to Scotland today. One of the key arguments for independence is the ability of Scotland to take our own decisions rather than having our future decided by politicians we didn't vote for, taking us down a path we haven't chosen. His presence highlights that." This is a political tweet relating to your support for the cause of independence in July 2020, isn't it?
It is, but it's also a response to the Prime Minister at the time coming to Scotland and very overtly describing that visit as a mission to save the Union. I think he had first-person pieces in at least one newspaper ahead of that. Now, in reflection, should I have risen to the debate and posted that tweet? Probably not. But I would never even have been in that space at all, but for the pretext of the Prime Minister's visit. I was also, because he was coming to Scotland, because of the narrative that the UK government had put around his visit, I was inevitably being asked about it in my briefings and interviews. But yeah, perhaps I should have been the bigger person and not reacted in that way with that tweet.
I had intended, of course, to put to you also the context, which is that on his visit, and I think in the newspapers before, Mr Johnson has spoken about the might and merit of the Union, and therefore your interpretation of that is that he was seeking to politicise the situation. Is that right?
I think I say in my written statement, to be fair, I don't think generally the UK government tried to politicise the pandemic. I think this was a rare exception to that. If they did...
So you think this was?
I think Boris Johnson, not coming to Scotland per se, but coming to Scotland with the narrative that they put around that, was an exception to what I've said. That I think generally they didn't try to politicise the pandemic. And other than this occasion, the occasions where I thought they did, it was more around, Brexit and the vaccine rollout being possible because of Brexit. So it's not a general accusation I would have levelled at them. I think this was an exception. I listened to parts of Michael Gove's evidence earlier in the week, and now realise that there may have been discussions at UK government level that led to this that I wasn't aware of at the time. Yeah. So this was a response. Was it as mature a response as with reflection I might have wished for? Perhaps not. But it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't me deciding suddenly to start talking about independence apropos of nothing. It was a response to the Prime Minister's visit and in particular the narrative of his visit.
Again, Ms Sturgeon, in fairness, I was also going to refer you to the paper that we took Mr Gove to, the State of the Union paper, which he delivered to the UK Cabinet on the 21st of July, 2 days before the visit, in which he described the risks to the Union as the greatest challenge for the UK government to confront, and said that protecting and strengthening the Union had to be the cornerstone of all that the UK government did. So I put to him that put some context, which of course you were not aware of at the time, to the visit. But your position, as I understand it, was that I may have politicised the pandemic, but he did it first.
No, I don't think I did politicise the pandemic at all. I responded to a particular narrative of his with a tweet and undoubtedly some answers to media questions. And the answers to media questions were unavoidable because I took lots of questions every day from journalists. The tweet, yeah, perhaps I shouldn't have, but I don't think a tweet adds up to politicising the pandemic. Perhaps I was just trying to defend the position against the claims that were being made.
Perhaps, though, the accumulation of evidence which we've looked at might suggest that there was an attempt on your part to politicise the pandemic.
I would strongly argue the reverse. And with respect if the evidence that's been put to me today is the evidence of that, I would say it demonstrates nothing of the sort.
In the period after the election, did you attempt to revive the campaign for a second independence referendum?
I think the work that on a second independence referendum did not restart in government until much later in 2021.
There was an announcement that you made in September 2021.
Which is some 6 months or more after the Scottish election.
What I'm interested in exploring is whether, in fact, there was within the Scottish Government an attempt to seek to do so before that. We went with Mr Thompson to an entry in his diary from a period in May 2021, shortly after the election, in which, amongst some reflections about his position and his future role within the Scottish Government, he wrote the words, "Indie back." Does that not suggest that it was a policy of the Scottish Government at that time to try to seek independence again, despite the fact that you made no announcement to that effect until September?
As a matter of fact, it was not the case that work on independence restarted at that point. We were still in a very challenging situation with COVID through the summer of 2021. So I heard Ken Thompson's answer to what that meant, that he was looking ahead to things that might be on the horizon for civil servants and the varying degrees of challenges they might be facing. As a matter of fact, independence work did not restart at that point. So at the risk of contradicting somebody I've got the highest regard for at that point, Indy was not back.
I'd like to ask you some questions about the zero COVID or elimination strategy, which we've touched on already. You say in your statement, I was of the view that zero COVID in the period before a vaccine was available was an aim worth striving for. I knew that our circumstances, particularly if the rest of the UK was not following suit, meant it was unlikely to be completely achievable for any sustained period of time. Was there a zero COVID policy in the Scottish Government in the summer of 2020?
There was a maximum suppression strategy. I think the phraseology that was used, and it was in, if not our first strategic framework, then later iterations of that, was suppressed to the lowest possible level and keep it there. It is undoubtedly the case that we would have colloquially used terms like zero COVID and elimination, although emphatically not eradication, which was a very different concept, to describe that strategy in shorthand. Basically what we and I was articulating, I on many occasions explained this at briefings and in response to questions. At no point was my belief that we would get COVID to a level where it was eliminated and went away. That would take a vaccine. But in the days before a vaccine and before effective treatments, when COVID, the direct harm of COVID was so severe, we needed to suppress it as far as possible, both to protect life, but also to create the conditions where we could start to safely open up the economy and society, and that the best way of achieving maximum suppression was to try to drive it as low or as close to zero as possible. And that was the position of the Scottish Government, certainly throughout the summer of 2020. That strategic objective changed later, I think around about the spring, early summer of 2021, when we got to the position where growing and significant numbers of the population were vaccinated.
On the 14th of April 2020, the Scottish COVID Advisory Group provided a formal advice entitled Lockdown Review, in which the government was advised that it was the group's advice that in the context of there being no vaccine or specific drug treatments available to prevent or treat COVID-19, and to quote, "We do not believe that it will be possible for the foreseeable future to eradicate the SARS-CoV-2 virus, henceforth virus. We need to find ways of living with the virus as best as possible, which includes protecting the NHS and social care capacity to care for citizens." Around this time, what planning did the Scottish Government have about the prospect, or the requirement that had been advised by the COVID Advisory Group that there would need to be found ways of living with the virus?
We were already actively planning for that, and in fact, off the back of the kind of advice that was coming through, we published in late April 2020 our strategic framework for decision making. There were other publications with more detail in that through May, and then of course that I think on the 28th or later in May, round about that time, we published the route map for exiting lockdown, which set out different phases of lifting the restrictions and therefore opening up and starting to live with the virus while keeping it, to use an expression for shorthand, as under control as we could. The word eradication appears in that advice. I just want to stress it was never, eradication and elimination mean very different things. In preparation for today, I came across the way I articulated the elimination strategy in a briefing, I think in June 2020, where I say explicitly, elimination is not eradication. It is about getting the virus to the lowest levels you can, which doesn't mean it has gone away and doesn't mean it won't rise again, but it gives us more confidence that we can keep it under control with surveillance, testing and contact tracing, and with targeted measures as opposed to blanket lockdowns. That's what was meant by it. It was a way of, all through this, we got it, including from the COVID Advisory Group and certainly from SAGE. As we came out of lockdown, we had to come out of it in a way that avoided the R number going above 1 again. And people will recall references across all the governments at the time to how much headroom we had, and therefore we had to open up in a phased way. And that's what we were trying to do. Open up, learn to live with the virus, but keep it under control so that it didn't take off again and start overwhelming us in the way that it had in previous in the early stages. That was a very difficult balance to strike. It involved lots of judgments about what could open, what had to stay closed, what the phasing of that was, but that's what we were trying to achieve.
Can I just check that we've got the note correct, because that is what I understood you to say. Did you say elimination and eradication are different things?
Yes.
Aren't they the same thing?
No. In this sort of epidemiological, I think you will find comments from Gregor Smith and comments he's made. I came across one in a committee in the Scottish Parliament that we both appeared at. Eradication effectively means you get to a point where the disease has gone away and it's not a risk anymore. With COVID, that was likely and understood likely to only come with vaccines. Elimination was effectively, as I put it there, it doesn't mean it's gone away, it doesn't mean it won't rise again. You're taking measures to try to keep it at a level as close to no cases as possible, but it doesn't mean that if you lift those measures, it won't start to transmit again. So in epidemiological terms, I'm not an expert on this.
No,
Other people can explain
but it
it much
sounds as
better
if people are
than
playing
me.
fast and loose with the language. But
Well, I was trying, obviously not as successfully as I hoped to. I read out a quote there from a briefing in June 2020, where I'm obviously being asked these very questions, and I start by saying elimination is not eradication. I didn't come to that conclusion myself. That was the
expert advice.
The expert advice that was being given to me.
Language in this regard is, of course, important, Ms Sturgeon, isn't it?
Very much so, and I always tried to be as precise as I could in my language, hence explanations like that. I am not suggesting for a second I always succeeded.
Because the language of zero COVID and elimination or eradication permeated the public's understanding of what the objective was, didn't it?
In that we were trying to get to a point where we were suppressing the virus as much as possible.
But the word suppression wasn't the word that was generally used by the Scottish Government at this time, was it?
I believe, and it's my opinion, and others will take a different view, I think the level of understanding of the public at that time was very sophisticated, and I think there was an understanding of what was being talked about, what was meant. Language is really important, but sometimes, one of the things I think I was perhaps criticised for on the day of lockdown was calling it an effective lockdown. When the Prime Minister at the time didn't use the term lockdown, I took the view that we needed to communicate with people in language that they were using themselves, that they could understand, that we could then make sure was defined. So I think there was an understanding of what was meant by that we couldn't make COVID go away, but we could keep it at levels that wouldn't overwhelm us, get contact tracing and surveillance and testing back so that it was allowing us, as for much of 2020, from through the autumn of 2020 before the Alpha variant came, we managed to do through particular outbreaks, outbreak control, then the levels system that we used for a period. We were having a degree, not complete, but a degree of success in that, and that was only possible because we had got over the summer the virus to a sufficiently low level to allow those approaches to be successful.
The language is important, Ms Sturgeon, because the language of elimination or eradication rather than maximum suppression, which is a phrase you're using just now, gave people the impression that COVID was over, didn't it?
I genuinely and very firmly don't believe that was the impression at any point in Scotland over that period. To be clear, I never used the term eradication. I was at pains when asked about it to be clear I wasn't talking about eradication. But I don't believe that was the view in Scotland over any
Ms
part of
Sturgeon, do you know
2020.
perfectly well that people jumped on planes to Spain and this caused the second wave?
Well, we've just been talking about how we tried to, deal in a way that was cautious around travel to other countries, including Spain. Some people went on holiday that summer. I think many people didn't. I think many people tried. Many people wouldn't have gone on holiday at all. Many people who did stayed in Scotland and holidayed at home. Some people would have gone overseas. I genuinely don't believe that was because people thought, the majority of people thought COVID had gone away. I stood up every day and reminded people COVID hadn't gone away and wasn't going to suddenly and magically go away. And I think there was a very high degree of understanding. And I've talked earlier on about criticism, perhaps, and I don't mean this as a criticism of them. Some of our sternest critics over this period were the airport sector, who felt that my messaging in Scotland was actually making it, was discouraging people from going on foreign holidays at a time when they thought they were being encouraged in perhaps other parts of the UK.
You wanted to have the reputation, did you not, of the person who had driven COVID out of Scotland?
I'd never thought I was capable of driving COVID out of Scotland. I hoped that the decisions my government would take would keep COVID at the lowest possible level so that it took the lives of fewer people, minimised the disruption to people's livelihoods and the education of children, the thing I find, I guess, forgive me, I appreciate I'm here to answer your questions, I'm not. I accept this, that there will be genuine and serious scrutiny about the content of decisions that were taken, and some of those decisions I wish I'd taken, my government had taken differently. Some, I think, were right. My motives in this were only ever about trying to do the right thing to minimise the overall harm that the virus was doing. The toll it took in Scotland, as in other parts of the UK, was far too high, so I didn't do that as successfully as I wish I had been able to. But perhaps in some ways, the measures we took had some impact. Professor Serene Diamond, the UK statistician's evidence to this inquiry, looking at the quite significant lower deaths in terms of COVID-19 on an age standardised basis in Scotland than in other parts of the UK, still far too high. We were always trying to protect people and to minimise harm in all of its forms. And the nature and the content and the substance of those decisions deserve to be scrutinised as closely as possible. It genuinely, I take it very, very personally when people question the very motives, because I know that the motives were absolutely in good faith and for the best reasons.
Your desire to be the person that drove COVID out of Scotland was the reason why you entered into direct Twitter messaging with Professor Sridhar, whom Professor Morris, the chair of the COVID group, has told us was in a minority of one in being the only person on that group who thought that COVID could be driven out of Scotland at that time.
I don't think that is a fair representation of her view, but I'm not here to speak for her. Can I just say, I didn't, this wasn't about my reputation as the person who drove COVID out of Scotland. I desperately wanted to minimise the harm of COVID in Scotland. I was not under any illusions about the reality of the situation we faced. I reached out to Professor Sridhar, I think for two main reasons. One was that she was a member of the advisory group, but she was also somebody, I think, to her great credit, who was seeking to communicate through the media messages that she thought was important regularly. As a result of that, I was periodically being asked for my response to views she'd expressed, and I wanted to, make sure I understood where she was coming from. She was also, I knew, very plugged into the responses in different countries. I think she had connections into the WHO, the government of New York at the time, and other countries. And I was at that stage, I just wanted to understand as much as I could about the pandemic, about other countries' approaches. It was part of a process of me just trying to make sure I wasn't missing anything, I wasn't overlooking anything, and that while I wasn't trying to elevate one voice over others, I was wanting to make sure that if she was a minority voice, that I wasn't losing a different perspective, that I was able to hear, that it wasn't being lost in the consensus, that I was able to hear the diversity of views. And again, the motives were only, whatever mistakes and misjudgments I might have made, the motives were only about trying to equip myself as well as I could to do the job that I was in the position of having to do.
Your messages with her demonstrate a coordination of the two of yours media strategy. What you were trying to equip yourself with was the view of a scientist who would support your view that elimination was possible, even although she was in a minority of one on your COVID advisory group.
I don't believe that the messages, whatever the impression the messages might give, I know there was no coordination of media strategy. My media strategy was fairly obvious and well established. She was speaking in the media generally. There was an alignment. I wanted the Scottish Government to be suppressing COVID as much as possible, and whether she believed that could go further than others believed it could, and that I believed it could. Generally, the thrust of those messages was in vein with what the advice to me was and to the messages we were communicating to the public.
She frequently runs what she intends to say in the press and in press interviews by you in order to ensure that your positions are aligned.
The volume of Professor Sridar's media output would suggest that if she ever did that, it was on a very small number of occasions. But also in terms of, I would very, very frequently in the question and answers that followed my daily briefings, be asked about her views. So some of what you're reading in messages about and putting to me as coordination was simply, flagging up things she'd said in order that I knew what it was when I was asked about it. I come back to a point I keep making. My decisions and judgments can and should be scrutinised. My motives were never anything other than just trying to do the best I could in a situation that at times, I'm sure for every decision maker, felt as close to impossible as I've ever experienced.
The focus on the elimination strategy took the Scottish Government's eye off the need to prepare for a second wave, which experts would have told you was inevitable, did it not?
We knew a second wave was almost inevitable, as close to inevitable as anything was. No, it didn't.
Preparation was done for it.
That I don't accept that is the case. We, through the autumn of 2020, we went from lockdown to an opening up of the country through the route map rather that we'd set out at the end of May. We got to a point where we couldn't go to the final phase of that because of the epidemiology at the time. We then had a period where instead of reimposing measures, we were able to deal with outbreaks. We had some very localised outbreaks. We dealt with them through specific measures, and then the level system was applied. And actually, contrary to we didn't do anything to prepare for a second wave, we had continued to build up the testing and contact tracing capacity there that was a necessary part of trying to mitigate and minimise a second wave and deal with that as it happened. As it happened, the second, we didn't go into a second lockdown in November 2020 in Scotland. The second lockdown in Scotland came when the Alpha variant came along. So I don't accept that our eye was off the ball. I think we were taking difficult decisions, reaching difficult balances in the best way we possibly could. And I think the evidence overall is that while our response was far from avoiding all of the horrible, horrendous harm that was done, I would say an assessment of the outcomes overall suggests that while our approach was far from perfect, it actually managed to mitigate some harm that perhaps wasn't mitigated in some other places.
In his statement to this module, Professor Mark Woolhouse states at paragraph 345 that the start of the vaccine rollout, vaccine campaign, which you'll remember, Ms Sturgeon, started towards the end of 2020 and into 2021, created a false impression that the pandemic would soon be over and described it as over-optimistic. Professor Sridhar, when we looked at your direct messages with her, when I asked her why the messages had stopped at the end of 2020, gave the answer that when the vaccine arrived, input of the nature that I had been providing with regard to fighting the virus was no longer necessary. Was it your view and that of the Scottish Government that the pandemic would soon be over as a result of the arrival of the vaccine?
No. The pandemic is, we're no longer in a pandemic, but people are dying from COVID every week as we speak. Last year, I think 2,000 people died of COVID. COVID has not gone away. Arguably, COVID will never go away. And I have never believed otherwise. In fact, I, at points, face criticism for almost suggesting the for suggesting the alternative. I was criticised at points for being the voice of doom around COVID. What happened with the vaccine was that we entered a different phase. We entered a phase where, unlike the situation until that point, we haven't talked yet, I don't know whether we will, about the Scottish Government's 4 harms approach. We had no way of mitigating harm 1, which was the direct health impact of COVID. So we had to, albeit trying to minimise harm overall, we had to have a particular focus on reducing harm 1 and harm 2 to some extent as well. When the vaccine came along, we had a way of mitigating harm 1 without restrictions, which allowed us then to rebalance towards harms 3 and 4. So we entered a very different phase of the pandemic because of the impact of vaccination. And that's why across all of the 4 nations, we put such a great emphasis on, as fast as possible, a rollout of the vaccination campaign.
Could I ask you to have a look, please, at INQ 000334792? Returning to exchange between Mr. Youssef and Professor Leach, this time on the 10th of June 2021, pages 12 to 13.
Forgive me, I'm not seeing it.
Sorry, yes, we'll just get it up. My apologies. So again, this is an exchange in June of 2021. You may recall, Ms. Sturgeon, that which we looked at this with the current First Minister, one of the characteristics of the fight against the virus in 2021 was that there were a number of large events which ran the risk of spreading the virus, and decisions needed to be taken around whether those should be allowed to go ahead or not. This was a discussion in particular around the decision-making with regard to the possibility of cancelling a fan zone which had been put together for the Euros in Glasgow, which it was eventually allowed to go ahead. And the exchange says at 11:45, Professor Leach says, and still it goes on, FM wants more advice. Her instinct says cancel fan zone. Her office will write back, which Ken is writing, to ask for more, and then Ken will gather legal, etc. to reply. Mr. Youssef says, yes, she messaged me this morning, wants more detail from GCC around costs involved if we cancel. And then there's some discussion around how much it would cost. £6 million is mentioned. And then at 11:53, Mr. Youssef says, £6 million seems cheap for 31 days. Wonder if that factors in costs of food and beverage suppliers would have expected to make over the course of the fan zone, may look for compensation. Either way, if FM is going to cancel, needs to be done soon. She could hold the line and see how we get on and what the scenes on Monday look like. If people behave, then that might settle her nerves. Professor Leach, yep, I think that's costs, not profit. And he says she needs to do it before or at FMQs, if at all. And then Mr. Youssef says, I'll tell you what, from knowing her for 15 years, it is not often her instincts are wrong. Both Professor Leach and Mr. Youssef, the then Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, seem to be describing the ultimate decision taken in connection with the possible cancellation of this event as a matter which will be governed by your instincts. That's how you made decisions during the course of the pandemic, wasn't it, Ms. Sturgeon?
I think had the fan zone been cancelled, that is certainly an accusation that, based on this exchange, could have been made at me. But the fan zone wasn't cancelled, therefore my instinct didn't govern the decision. That was my instinct. I was, the Euros delayed by a year were happening. The fan zone did make me very nervous about people coming together in that way, given what we were dealing with. That was my instinct. I asked for further advice and consideration. That advice came back, and I was persuaded on the basis of the advice that my instinct was not what we should go with. We should go with the advice, and that is the position. You have in managing a situation like this, you have instincts about what's sensible and what's not sensible in a whole host of things. If I had made decisions purely on the basis of that, then that would have been deeply misguided. But I didn't. I had an instinct. I probed the question. I asked for advice through proper channels. I considered that advised carefully, and on the basis of that agreed that it should go ahead. And as it turns out, I think it was the right decision to allow it to go ahead, because it did not, the risk that I'd been worried about did not materialise.
Would you agree with the proposition, Ms Sturgeon, that the Scottish Government's pandemic strategy was run on your instincts?
No.
Decisions were ultimately made not by Cabinet, but by you and a small band of trusted advisers.
As I've said earlier on, I think the evidence before the inquiry of the Cabinet papers and the Cabinet minutes show that that is not the case. I was the First Minister. I had a responsibility to lead, to try to see the whole picture when Cabinet Secretaries, rightly and properly, are focused on their own portfolio interests. In any leadership position, you have instincts, you learn to trust, or also to know not when not to trust your instincts. But as this exchange, again, I would say, if this exchange had ended with her instinct is to cancel the fan zone, and at 12 o'clock at First Minister's Questions I had stood up and announced the cancellation of the fan zone, that would prove, I think, the proposition you're putting to me. But it didn't. I had an instinct. I tested it with the experts. I asked for advice. I considered that advice. And on the basis of that advice, decided the opposite of what my instinct had started out telling me.
Part of your instinct is based on a desire to seek to advance this cause of Scottish independence, isn't it?
Not in the management of the pandemic. I don't think it's any. I don't think I'm breaking any news today to say that I have spent a lifetime campaigning for independence. I will no doubt continue to campaign for independence. I know I will. But when in a position of leadership and decision making, you are confronted with a global pandemic. And as I remember sitting one night in probably February 2020 in Butte House with a set of reasonable worst case scenario figures in front of me and a figure for the potential number of deaths that might unfold, which thankfully didn't unfold at that level, my instincts became something completely different. In that moment, my only instinct, and the instinct I brought to the management of the pandemic, was how do I lead a government that makes the best possible decisions in horrific circumstances to try to minimise the harm that this virus is going to do. And people will make their own judgments about me, about my government, about my decisions, but for as long as I live, I will carry the impact of these decisions. I will carry regret at the decisions and judgments I got wrong. But I will always know in my heart and in my soul that my instincts and my motivation was nothing other than trying to do the best in the face of this pandemic.
It was your instinct to seek to create a difference between your approach and that of the UK government, despite the obvious need in the face of the virus for a collaborative strategy, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't. It was my instinct to do everything I thought was necessary and appropriate to minimise harm to the people of Scotland. That was my instinct. And where that necessitated being different to the UK government, it was more important to me that we did what we thought in Scotland was right than it was in aligning with decisions we thought were wrong and would potentially increase harm rather than minimise harm. I feel to my core that the number of lives lost to this pandemic were far too high. We were never going to be able to get through a pandemic with no loss of life. I think it was far too high. I think the other impacts were far too high. And every death is a tragedy that I regret, and that people in this room and outside across the country are living with the grief and trauma of. So we didn't do as well as I wish we were able to. I think I quoted the evidence to the inquiry from Serene Diamond. On the age standardised mortality measure, the one that he says is legitimate, the deaths in Scotland were significantly lower than in other parts of the UK, far, far too high. But that says to me that even if it was only at the margins, our decision-making managed to minimise the harm to some extent. And that was my duty.
It was your instinct to seek to move away from existing structures which had been designed to try to manage procedures in this type of situation, like COBRA and SAGE, and to form your own.
I would have, if I can address SAGE and COBRA, it wasn't my decision when COBRA met, how often it met. I wish COBRA had continued to meet. The Prime Minister at the time decided not to have COBRA meetings. I wasn't able to convene COBRA meetings at my own hand, and so I am not responsible for the frequency of COBRA meetings. SAGE, I thought SAGE did a very good job during the pandemic. At the outset of the pandemic, I thought the quality of advice coming from SAGE was very high. I had two concerns about it, or about having that as the sole source of advice. One was, understandably, and this is not a criticism, its advice was not necessarily tailored to the demographics, the health profile, the epidemiology in Scotland. And secondly, I had no ability. I didn't even know at the start of the pandemic who was on SAGE. I had no ability as a First Minister to speak directly to people on SAGE, to ask them questions, to deepen my understanding. So I asked for an advisory group to be established in Scotland, not to replace SAGE, but to help fill those gaps. SAGE and the advisory group, through, and put on record my deep thanks to Andrew Morris, who chaired the advisory group, it established reciprocity. So Andrew became a member of SAGE, papers were shared. It was not seeking to replace SAGE, it was augmenting and supplementing SAGE, so that I felt that the functions that SAGE wasn't able to perform for the Scottish Government were delivered in that way.
It was your instinct to be seen to be following a different path from the UK Government and to seek to get your word in public first, wasn't it?
No.
It was your instinct to keep decision-making secret and as regards the way that decisions were ultimately reached, the process by which they were made, recorded and retained?
No. I think delivered more than 250 public addresses over the course of the pandemic, where I answered, people will judge the quality of my answers in the way that they want, but answered questions. I didn't take one or two questions, I answered every question that came to me. I sought at every stage to be open, to be transparent, to level with the public about the complexity of this, the difficulties, the almost impossible balances we were trying to strike, and what we were taking into account in coming to the decisions we were coming to.
It was your instinct to think that you knew best, rendering the published strategies of the government and the apparent advisory structures around you nothing more than, to use Mark Woolhouse's words, rhetoric.
Absolutely not. We implemented the strategies of the government to the extent that the virus allowed us to. We changed and adapted them in line with how the virus was operating. I was reviewing some of the minutes of the COVID advisory group last night in preparation for today, and the minutes frequently have the Scottish Government officials reporting about how highly I valued the advice of the group, and them saying how much they valued the opportunities through the deep dives for us to speak together and for me to ask them questions and for them to be able to help. I was assisted. I did not know best. That's why I sought to take advice from as broad a range of people as I could. It's why I reached out to people like Professor Shridhar. It's why I read everything I could get my hands on. I did not know best. And I was assisted at every step by first-class clinical and medical and scientific advisors, by senior civil servants, principally in the Scottish Government, but let me put on record that was the case on the part of many people in the UK Government, people like Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, Jonathan Van Tam, people who were hugely helpful to me and to the Scottish Government and advisors, and I would not have been able to get through the task I had without their advice and expertise that I benefited from on a daily basis.
It was your instinct to seek to portray yourself as open and honest with the public, but at the same time to keep from them important elements of the management, such as the Nike conference, care home deaths, and the advice around the rugby, which allowed COVID into Scotland in the first place.
I am not sure that that last statement would be established by facts, but I stand to be corrected. The Public Health Scotland genomic survey study that was done later in 2020 that looked at the different ways in which COVID came into Scotland. I don't think it would be reasonable to draw from that the statement that the rugby brought the virus into Scotland, but I stand to be corrected on that if I am wrong. I've tried to be as I've tried to explain as fully as I can the decision making around Nike, the reasons for that, the legitimate reasons for that, but how I think it is reasonable that people think that was the wrong judgment. I keep saying there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pages of cabinet papers and cabinet minutes that set out, if that was all that was available on the record, sets out a comprehensive, full and detailed explanation of the decisions we reached, the choices we faced and the reasons that drove our decision making.
The people of Scotland deserve better than a pandemic strategy run on your instincts, did they not, Ms Sturgeon?
They did indeed, which is why they didn't get a pandemic run on my instincts.
We started these evidential hearings a couple of weeks ago with oral evidence from Mrs Jane Morrison, a representative of the Scottish COVID Bereaved group whose wife died of COVID acquired in a hospital in October 2020. Mrs Morrison and her group had sought answers about matters of significant concern to them and about the pandemic in a meeting with you in March 2021. They did not get them. In the statement of the Scottish COVID Bereaved to the inquiry, the remaining representatives of many who died, these words appear: hubris does not stop a pandemic. The story of COVID in Scotland is the story of the hubris of Nicola Sturgeon, is it not?
No, I do not believe that to be the case. I am in the fortunate position of not having personally lost anyone to COVID. I wish with every fibre of my being that the decisions my government have been able to take could have reduced the number of people in Scotland today who did lose someone to COVID. And I am deeply sorry to each and every bereaved person and each and every person who suffered in other ways. I did my best, my government did our best, and people will judge that. But I know that every day I tried my best and those working with me tried our best to steer this country through the COVID pandemic in the best way we could.
Thank you, Ms Sturgeon. I have no further questions. There are some questions from Scottish.
I think Mr McCaffrey has some questions.
Obliged, my lady. Ms Sturgeon, I'm instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of Scottish COVID Bereaved. With reference to your statement, which is found at INQ 000339033, and your evidence this morning that you wish to deepen your knowledge about the virus, I'd like to take you to paragraph 149, subparagraph B of that statement, and this relates to you inquiring as to the possibility of asymptomatic transmission. You'll see there that it says, whether COVID-19 could be spread person to person asymptomatically, the initial advice I received was that asymptomatic transmission was not possible. My private office replied on my behalf and at my request with the following query. First Minister read information online in the last 24 hours, including references to an article in yesterday's Lancet, suggesting the opposite of this. That is, that people may be infectious before being symptomatic. What is the very certain statement in paragraph 14 based on? I received further advice from Public Health Scotland on the 25th of January, This included the following extracts. It is likely that person-to-person transmission, when it does occur, mostly involves transmission of virus from people with symptoms and infected people with symptoms. For example, someone who is coughing are much more likely to spread virus around than someone who is infected but free of symptoms. The evidence and advice on asymptomatic transmission remained uncertain until around April or May 2020, after which there seemed to be more of an acceptance that asymptomatic transmission was an issue. So my question, Ms Sturgeon, is therefore, why then, if by that date you knew that asymptomatic transfer was possible, would you consider that releasing people from hospital to care homes, but only testing if they had symptoms, was any protection at all? And on the basis of this advice received from Public Health Scotland that asymptomatic transmission was a possibility, why was it maintained that there was any uncertainty about this issue? Would it therefore not have been prudent to have erred on the side of safety?
Thank you. If I can very briefly, as you can see from my evidence there and the extracts from advice and my responses to that advice, if I can summarise, I think, as it can be seen there, the issue of uncertainty was not so much a binary one of was there or was there not the possibility of asymptomatic transmission. The uncertainty was the extent to which that was a serious issue, and certainly the advice that came to me, and I think the advice from the WHO until certainly into the spring, perhaps early summer of 2020, was that there was uncertainty and disagreement about whether it was a very small risk or a much more substantial risk, and that was uncertain. However, notwithstanding uncertainty around asymptomatic transmission, what there also was, and certainly an advice that came to the Scottish Government, was an uncertainty about the reliability of testing in people who either were asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. So there was a concern, and it wasn't a suggestion that testing was not important, but there was a concern. And this was a concern that was still being expressed to the Scottish Government when, in April, when the Cabinet Secretary changed the position to testing of all admissions from care homes, from hospitals to care homes. There was a concern that testing on its own could give rise to false assurance. Somebody who tested negative may still have the virus if they were asymptomatic. That is why the early advice around care homes focused very much on isolation and keeping people separate. And notwithstanding the limited availability of the testing at the time, there was a concern that testing on its own would not be sufficient to guard against those risks. On care homes in particular, I think there are very serious issues for all of us to reflect on here. Testing is undoubtedly a significant part of that. Discharges from hospitals in particular are a very serious part of that. And I'm not shying away from that. But I also think there are other issues around care homes, and all of which the Scottish Government has to take responsibility for, that we mustn't lose sight of in a focus only on testing. The report that Public Health Scotland did later in 2020 about discharges from hospital showed that almost all care homes in Scotland over that period from March through to May had discharges from hospital, but only a third of those care homes had an outbreak of COVID or had residents who died from COVID. So that suggests that yes, discharges and the circumstances of discharges must be looked at seriously. But that would suggest, and the number of deaths were very heavily concentrated in relatively small numbers of care homes. So there are other issues, I think, that we need to probe very, very seriously around the structure and the size of the care home sector, the resources and the regulation in care homes. These are all profoundly important issues. Testing is a significant and important part of that, but my view is that there are other aspects of that that we must also make sure we consider in the course of a fuller examination around the situation in care homes.
Well, that just goes back to the latter part of the question, that with all that uncertainty and the lack of capacity in testing, would it not have been prudent to err on the side of safety and not discharge to care homes?
When we were in the early part of the pandemic, and I'm talking here about late February into March 2020, the objective was where somebody didn't have the medical need to be in hospital, it was better for them to be discharged. I mean, that is genuinely true at all times, but we were watching on television in countries like Italy, hospitals filling up with COVID patients. So yes, we wanted to make sure we had available capacity in our hospitals to deal with people who needed hospital treatment, but there was also a concern that hospitals would not have been safe in terms of the virus for vulnerable people who didn't need to be in hospital. I do not think we got everything right around care homes, and I deeply regret that. But I also know that it wasn't the case that we didn't think about the best way to try to protect people in care homes. The guidance, there were undoubtedly flaws and deficiencies in that guidance, but the advice at that time was that isolation, keeping people as separate as possible, it was the best way to protect people in care homes. Now, clearly, that didn't have the effect that we wanted it to. I am, of all of the important issues around this pandemic, the situation in care homes is one of the most important to properly scrutinise and understand. I am, I suppose, simply saying that I think testing is an important part of that, but I think for me, it raises a lot of other issues about care homes, the care home sector, how the ways in which we sought to protect people and the effectiveness of that. And I think it is in the interest, and it's a duty to those who are bereaved, who have lost people in care homes, that we do understand that in the fullest possible way.
Thank you. Could I maybe ask you just to try and keep your responses as short as possible? Obviously, we're limited in time, and we want to get through as many questions as we can. Moving on to document reference INQ 000370312, and that should come up on screen at page 4 of that document. Didn't your inquiries at the end of January, when Public Health Scotland explained that asymptomatic transfer could occur in response to your question about it, mean that you did indeed know about asymptomatic transfer at the relevant time? So the phrase quoted there that we see on screen, "and we didn't know what we know now about asymptomatic transmission," was in fact incorrect?
No, perhaps it's not as fully expressed there as I've had the opportunity to do to you today. If you go back to the statement you showed me a moment ago, it was actually me who first queried a briefing saying, I don't think it is right to say that asymptomatic transmission cannot happen. So it wasn't that we didn't know asymptomatic transmission couldn't happen, but we didn't know at the outset what we came to know, that it was potentially a significant driver. The response that came back to me from Health Protection Scotland, as it was then, still was saying they thought it was overwhelmingly likely that it was people with symptoms who would transmit. So we didn't know everything we came to know about asymptomatic transmission when I made that statement, but that's not the same thing as saying we didn't know anything about it.
Were you aware of any recommendations made by Scottish Care in March 2020 in relation to the need for robust clinical assessment and testing of residents entering care homes, both from the community and acute NHS settings? And if so, how did this affect your decision making?
I was aware of comments and recommendations that Scottish Care and other organisations and bodies were making. I don't know whether I was aware of the specific ones you're quoting to me there. We sought to factor all of that into our decision making. We extended testing to care homes and to a range of other settings as we built up testing capacity. When, however, we didn't think that it was ever safe to rely only on testing, for the reasons that even if we accept asymptomatic transmission happens, there is and was doubt about the reliability of tests to detect the virus in people who were asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. When I was preparing for today's session, on the day, I think the 21st of April, when Jean Freeman made the statement in Parliament extending testing to all admissions from hospital to care homes, the advice that was still coming to us at that point was sceptical about testing and a concern that it would take away a focus on isolation and other infection prevention and control means. And so we factored all of this in to our decision making, and on this, as on other things, tried to make the best decisions that we could in the circumstances we were in at the time.
Were you aware of recommendations made in April 2020 to the Scottish Government in relation to the restriction on visiting care homes being increasingly disproportionate and failing to meet the pastoral needs and care of individuals, care needs of individuals, and the traumatic effect this was having on families? And if so, how did this affect your decision-making process?
In my experience and recollection, the issue of care home visiting was one of the most difficult, because I was aware of the increasing distress and trauma, both to care home residents and to their loved ones, of restrictions on visiting. And that was an issue on which we were always trying to strike a balance between opening up and allowing much more flexibility in terms of visiting, but trying to guard against infection being in homes. I don't think we got that right, possibly at all, but it was not because we didn't care, it was not because we didn't try to get that right. And I have had in the past, I have at the moment, relatives in care homes myself. I understand, or I think I can understand how awful that would have been for any family with a loved one in a care home at that time.
And when the United Kingdom government changed its policy in relation to care home testing on the 15th of April 2020, why did that not cause the Scottish Government to consider its position or review it?
We were considering and reviewing our position at that time. I think I'm getting the date right, that on the 21st of April, Jean Freeman announced a range of different things, including care home testing. So our position was under a constant, ongoing review and assessment at that time.
It is clear from the necessity of setting up the nosocomial review group in May 2020 that the Scottish Government realised that hospital-acquired infection was a particular risk. Can you explain why it was decided to set up this body early in the pandemic?
Because we understood, both from the emerging experience in COVID, but also from wider experience around hospital infection, the particular risks of nosocomial infection in hospitals, and we were seeking to make sure that on an ongoing basis there was expert advice and consideration given to how those risks could be reduced in hospitals.
Just going back to your statement, which I didn't take you to again, we looked at the beginning of questioning. In paragraph 455, you refer to the advice at that time was that the limitations of PCR testing for asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic cases may result in false assurance, and therefore the focus should be on infection prevention and control measures. Further, that the fact that there was limited availability of testing capacity in March 2020 and the World Health Organization guidance at the time was clear that testing all hospital discharges was not the best use of available capacity while it was still being expanded. And yet very frail people with complex needs were being moved in circumstances where you were aware of the problems of asymptomatic transfer, pre-symptomatic transfer, and the problems of false assurance. Why, therefore, was it considered in all these circumstances safer to move them at all? And would you have taken the same decision again, knowing what you know now? And if not, what would you have done differently and why?
I would desperately try to find ways of managing the situation of elderly people in hospital who didn't have a medical need to be in hospital differently, that would have, if not prevented, because in the face of what we were dealing with, I'm not sure prevention absolutely would ever have been possible, but to mitigate and minimise beyond what happened in reality. I would do everything in my power, and I wish I could turn the clock back and do different things that would have reduced the loss of life in care homes. But it wouldn't have changed a situation where leaving people in hospitals would not have been an option that was without risk. There was nosocomial infection in hospital. There were COVID patients in hospital. We didn't, thankfully, face the overwhelming of hospitals in the way that had been seen in other countries at the start of the pandemic. But hospitals would not have been a risk-free environment for vulnerable people either, and that's the context in which these decisions had to be made. And I desperately wish we could have had the ability to do things in a way that didn't result in the outcome that did materialise.
And wouldn't the retention of those patients in hospital have been the best place to meet their medical needs rather than discharging them to care homes where they were putting other vulnerable people in harm's way?
Anybody who had a medical need to be in hospital should have been in hospital. We were talking about discharge of people who didn't have a medical need to be in hospital, and discharge to their own home or to a care home was considered to be was considered to be better than keeping them in a hospital environment that in itself would not have been without risk of COVID transmission. That was the advice at the time. These were the judgments that were made at the time. And yes, I think it would have been, I wish we had been able to introduce testing earlier, more comprehensively. But I don't think that in and of itself would have removed the risks of care home admission. And that's why I'm saying I think there are a variety of other issues that also need to be properly considered in terms of the circumstances of discharge to care homes. But I don't think I can sit here and say that keeping people in hospital would have been without risks, or certainly that at that time would not have seemed to me to be the situation.
One final question, Ms Sturgeon. Were there any discussions about what would happen if the criminal trial of the former First Minister Alex Salmond was still ongoing at the time of lockdown? And did the fact that it was have any effect of the timing of the lockdown being put in place in Scotland?
No.
Thank you, my lady. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr McCaffrey. That completes the evidence for today.
Yes, thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Sturgeon. I don't know if I can guarantee that we won't be calling upon you again, but I know we've already called upon you twice, but it's probably unlikely, but thank you anyway for your help today. I notice some members of the public gallery are distressed. Please don't forget there is support available if you need it. Very well, 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Thank you, my lady.